How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Today I'm going to be kit bashing these zombie deep sea divers and building them a shipwreck to fight on. I began with a gesso board and I cut up some XPS foam to make up the foundation of the terrain, which in this case is the sea floor. Once the foam had been cut and glued together into a rough blocky hill shape, I carved it into a rough but less blocky hill shape using my utility knife. Be careful when you use utility knives not to wave them around fully extended like I do. The next step was to position the shipwreck. I started with a somewhat narrow ship shape and I rounded the stern. I made the ship 3 layers of foam tall to reach the height that I was looking for. Because I wanted the deck to have enough room to play a game with a decent amount of movement, I decided to add some extra width. I also ran the whole thing through my hot wire table to create a nice big ship wedge. Now, when I set this bad boy in place, it should have that nice 2-part sunken ship look. I made a smaller wedge to represent the other part of the ship as well. I carved a spot for the larger wedge piece to fit snugly, and then I glued both wedge pieces into position. And then I proceeded to start a hardwood flooring company. We specialize in hardwoods like balsa wood. I tried to create a nice broken deck that looked like it had taken a beating both before and after being sunk to the bottom of the sea. Off camera, I assembled the frame of a little quarter deck, or is it a poop deck? I'm not sure, to be honest, but it's a deck. I filled that out and then I glued it atop the stern. I followed that up with some little steps so that my sailors can reach the quarter poop deck, and I installed more hardwood flooring. I was a little neater with the installation of this deck, so I brought out my wire brush to get a little bit more grain and weathering on the wood. I also hit the lower deck with the brush just for good measure. I used my utility knife to carve some breaks between the planks, and then I added some trim pieces. For the outside of the ship, I decided to attempt to make the foam look like wood rather than install lots of little planks. My company installs hardwood floors, not siding, after all. After impressing some artificial panel lines and a bit of wire brushing, I think the texture achieved is passable as wood if you don't look too closely. I then finished up the floor on the other side and began snipping away things with my nippers to create a little bit of damage as well. Next, I used some plastic canvas, also known as granny grating, to create the large window at the back of the captain's cabin. Once that had been glued in place using some foam safe superglue, which is the only glue that I have used on the foam in this video, I framed it out with more balsa wood, and then I used more of the plastic canvas to create a grate cover for a hatch that will sit on the deck. I found a piece of a different kind of ship that was perfect for a broken mast. I glued the other part of my mast into the sand, and then I carved up a little dowel to make the cross beams of the mast that are resting against the ship. I then glued some pre-made plaster and resin rocks around the wreckage, and it was time to clean up my workstation and move on to the terrain paste. Once my workstation was free from debris, I put down a mat that isn't afraid to get a little messy. After slapping on some gloves, I mixed up my classic terrain paste. I used a combination of plaster of Paris, acrylic paint, Mod Podge, and a splash of water. After mixing that thoroughly, I applied it to the ground around the wreckage using a palette knife. I used the plaster mix once it had hardened a little bit to fill the gaps in the side of the base, and then I smoothed everything out with isopropyl alcohol and my gloved finger. I did the same thing for the dunes on the base, and then I added a little bit more wooden debris into the sand around the break in the ship. Once the wreckage had been thoroughly debrised, I mixed up some paint and Mod Podge and covered the remaining pink surfaces to protect them from the inevitable coming of the primer. When there was no more pink showing, it was time to leave it to dry, and while that does dry, let's move over to the minis. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I kit bashed each of these figures, bases included, but I did so in Hero Forge using their new kit bashing feature. Hero Forge is the sponsor of today's video, and they gave me early access to the feature, and I had a blast using it to create some original shipwreck zombies, as well as a crew of treasure hunting scuba divers. I use Hero Forge all the time, so when they asked to sponsor a video and give me early access to the feature, I was stoked. Let me show you how it works. Kit bashing is a new pro membership feature that does exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to kit bash your figures with up to 20 items from their extensive asset library, which I noticed didn't happen to have any scuba gear, so that's what I decided to kit bash for myself. You can manipulate, scale, and stretch the items however you'd like as long as they stay within the marked area, and when linked together the objects will scale and move as one unit, which is a fantastic tool. You can also adjust the figures into basically any pose you can think of. Obviously you can't just have the figures just floating in midair because that would make them unprintable. Luckily, they have a short quiz when you launch the feature to ensure that you understand what can and can't be printed, which is very helpful. One of the things I was very excited about for this feature was the ability to make custom bases for my minis, which I think has a huge impact on the storytelling potential of any miniature for wargaming or RPGs. Kit bashed minis can be purchased in any form that Hero Forge offers, and they're reviewed by a real person to make sure that they're properly printed. So a service fee is added on to the base price for that. I grabbed all of mine as STLs because I have a 3D printer at home, and that is the most convenient method for me. Overall, I was very impressed with kit bashing in Hero Forge, and it genuinely felt like kit bashing with bits from my bits box. I'm a huge fan of that. Be on the lookout, kit bashing will be available on HeroForge.com later this year. I printed my two favorite minis again in a larger scale, for me to paint for fun in my free time. While I paint these undead divers, let me tell you a little bit more about them. The guy on the right is Pachelbel. He doesn't have the best aim with his cannon, but as long as it's close, the shrapnel can typically do the rest of the work. On the left, we have Crafty Sam. Sam is the strongest of the three, and his armor and weapons he crafted himself using pieces of debris, which is what earned him his name. And lastly, we have the guy known as Treasure Guardian. He's called that because he guards the treasure. These treasure hunters all started as weekend diving enthusiasts, but once they discovered how lucrative treasure hunting could be, they all decided to go full time. Their diving gear is custom made, and once they decided to venture out into deep water where shipwrecks are guarded by zombies, they needed to develop some special weapons to deal with the new threats. After all the base colors had been applied, I gave them all an enamel pin wash to darken the recesses, and then I followed that up with the highlights. I applied some icy blue patina to all of the metal bits on the zombies, and then I finished off these bad boys with a sickly green glaze to tie everything together. The goal was to achieve a slightly creepy undead deep-sea diver look, and I'm pretty happy with the results. I added some highlights to the good guys, but I didn't add any of the grime. One thing I did add though was some little blue rings onto this harmless little octopus. With that, all of the miniatures had been painted. It was time to move on to painting the ship. Everything was dry at this point, so I took the ship outside and I primed it black. As you can see, I didn't get full coverage because I ran out of spray paint. So I loaded up my airbrush with some black primer and I finished the job. Once the ship was fully primed and the primer had had some time to dry, I began adding my layers of paint. My goal with this paint job was to create the effect of consistent underwater lighting across the whole ship, with not much color variation, kind of like you'd see on a shipwreck that's been chilling on the sea floor for quite some time. I gave the whole thing a coat of sea green before painting on some artificial sun rays being broken by the waves on the surface. This is an idea that I got from Kayakasaurus. The last thing to do was to paint the side of this game board / diorama with some black 4.0. Once all four sides had been fully covered, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Special thank you to Hero Forge for sponsoring today's video. If you would like to start kit bashing your own miniatures on Hero Forge and taking them to the next level, they will be launching that feature on HeroForge.com later this year. Be on the lookout. And of course, a huge shout out to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.